This is the city of Melbourne. 200 years ago, it didn't even exist. In the place of roads and buildings, there were trees, native grasslands and muddy riverbanks. We're going to explore modern Melbourne and look beneath the tall buildings, the busy roads and crowded railway stations to try to connect the past with the present. There were several attempts to establish a settlement in the area we now call Victoria between 1797 and the 1830s. As early as 1803, the area around Port Phillip Bay was described by surveyor Richard Grimes as an admirable place for a settlement. But apart from some whaling activity, very little happened until on the 29th of May 1835, a boat landed here at Indented Head, near the mouth of Port Phillip Bay. The whaling settlements have gone, of course. Now, Indented Head is a popular holiday and retirement destination for Victorians. This is a statue of John Batman. It was erected in 1979, together with one of John Faulkner, about whom we'll hear more shortly. It now stands in front of an office block at the corner of Market and Collins Streets, on a site that used to be where Melbourne's first fruit and vegetable market was located. This is what the Western Market, as it became called, looked like in the 1870s. As you can see, it was a rather lovely building, but like so much of Victorian Melbourne, it was demolished in the 1960s. This is what was constructed in its place. Perhaps fortunately, the site is scheduled for redevelopment. Batman got together with a group of investors and set off from Van Diemen's Land, the island we now call Tasmania, to explore this region across Bass Strait called the Port Phillip District, the area we now call Victoria, with the hope that they might make money by farming the land and establishing a settlement. In his journal, Batman wrote of his intentions to have friendly meetings with the local inhabitants to establish a treaty for the purchase of what he describes as fertile and hitherto useless territory. Of course, the useless territory that Batman refers to had been home to the Wurundjeri and other Aboriginal groups for thousands of years and certainly wasn't useless to them. By all accounts, these earliest meetings were quite friendly, with gifts such as baskets, beads and sugar exchanged as a sign of friendship. This memorial, which stands close to the beach at Indented Head, marks the place where Batman may have first landed. Matthew Flinders, mentioned here, was an English naval explorer who surveyed the coastline of Australia some time earlier. The area where Batman arrived is still used as a landing place, but for smaller craft. Batman's business partner, John Wedge, the families of the settlers and their stores, were left to set up a base at Indented Head, while Batman and his crew set off to explore Port Phillip Bay. He started his exploring here at Geelong, which is about 70 kilometres from where Melbourne was eventually established. This is Corio Bay, which is where Batman probably first landed. It's now overlooked by apartment blocks, carefully tended gardens and boathouses, but back then it was bush and grassland. Part of the Foreshore Reserve developed into an important tourist and recreational precinct called Steam Packet Place. The name recalls a time when steamships would visit Geelong with supplies for the town. Geelong is now a substantial city with a population of 210,000. Batman walked inland and found good pasture, but no Aborigines from whom he could buy land. So he sailed further round the bay to the Saltwater River, an inlet that marks the mouth of the Yarra. This has now become Williamstown Dockyard on one bank and Port Melbourne on the other. Batman sailed past this point where the Westgate Bridge spans the river, to here where the Maribyrnong meets the Yarra and where Swanston Dock and many industrial complexes now line the riverbank. The land is coming under increasing pressure for redevelopment. This is Victoria Dock, which is earmarked for development. A little closer to Melbourne City, the vast Docklands project now dominates the river. After exploring the hinterland, he decided this would be a good place for a settlement. With the help of his Aboriginal guides, he found some local Aborigines and arranged a meeting. On June the 6th, he came here to the banks of the Merry Creek, close to Dights Falls, where he met with 8 Wurundjeri elders. He asked the Aborigines for 600,000 acres of land in exchange for an annual payment of these everyday items and a promise of care and employment. It's impossible to know how much the Aborigines understood about this sale. The Indigenous custodians of the would have been most unlikely to have understood what they were giving away, or indeed that they were giving anything away at all. The area covered by this so-called treaty was a very large piece of land, even by today's standards. It extended from Geelong in the west up to the area where Melbourne International Airport now is in the north, and to Bundoora, where La Trobe University now stands in the east. There's a famous passage in John Batman's diary which reads, "The boat went up the large river I have spoken of, which comes from the east, and I'm glad to state about 6 miles up found the river all good water and very deep. This will be the place for a village." So the 3 key things that this site had that made it suitable for settlement were a good deep harbour for anchoring, a plentiful supply of fresh water, and good fertile land that could be used for farming crops and sheep. Today we still use the harbour and the water, and although most of the land is now used for buildings, between Melbourne and Geelong there's still some remnants of land left that's used for farming. Batman returned to the others at Indented Head. He wrote to Governor Arthur requesting that the British government honour the treaty that he'd made with the Aborigines and provide funds to set up a settlement and farms. This street is named after Richard Bourke, Governor of New South Wales at the time. In 1835, Victoria didn't exist. It was all part of New South Wales. So Arthur passed Batman's request on to Bourke. Bourke issued a proclamation that claimed all land in Australia for the British Crown, on the basis that it was terra nullius, or empty land. Batman's treaty was ruled invalid, because insofar as the British were concerned, the Indigenous people didn't own the land at all. Until the British arrived, the land didn't belong to anyone. You'll remember this plaque commemorating John Faulkner. His in the story starts about this time. Back in Launceston, he'd heard rumours of Batman's expedition and saw an opportunity to make money. So he sent an advance party to Port Phillip Bay on board his ship, the Enterprise. He couldn't leave Launceston himself because he owed people some money. This is a modern replica of the ship in dock in Melbourne. It's been carefully copied from the original plans, and it's available for tours and sailings. You can even sleep on board. Faulkner's statue can be found at the corner of Market and Collins Streets, close to the statue of Batman we saw earlier. This small lane at South Bank, behind the Arts Centre, is one of the streets in Melbourne after Faulkner. Faulkner Park is located off Toorak Road in South Yarra, about 5 kilometres from the city centre. There's also a suburb named Faulkner to the north of the city. The men sailed their boat up the Yarra and dropped anchor below some falls, close to where I'm standing, where Queen's Bridge now spans the Yarra. This is a view from Queen's Bridge along the river to where the falls would have been. This photograph of the same location was taken 22 years later, in 1857. You can see the small falls here. They mark the place where the river meets the seawater. On 30th, 35, Captain John Lancy and his party landed here on the banks of the Yarra and started to clear land, build a store and plant vegetables. This park, close to Melbourne Aquarium, commemorates that significant event, the day that the settlement that was to become Melbourne was founded. The park is overshadowed by 2 railway viaducts that carry lines from Flinders Street to Southern Cross Station. Close by, near Queen's Bridge, is Enterprise Wharf. On October the 11th, Faulkner arrived together with his family. He cleared an area of around 2 hectares, that's about 5 of these hockey fields. That's quite a lot of trees to cut down. It's hard to imagine farming going on here today, but this was where Faulkner's cleared land was, at the junction of Spencer and Flinders Streets, close to where Southern Cross Station now stands. He built a simple house and tried to make peace with the local Aborigines by enlisting the help of William Buckley, an ex-convict who'd spent 30 years living with the Aborigines. Buckley was only partially successful, and there were increasingly violent attempts by the indigenous people to reclaim their land. But faced with deluges and livestock that quickly arrived, and diseases that the settlers brought with them to which the Aborigines had no immunity, they had little hope. Batman arrived back with his family, ready to settle on the land he'd marked out. He built a house on a hill overlooking Faulkner's land. The hill was removed in the 19th century to allow for an extension of the railway system to Batman's Hill Station, now renamed Southern Cross. Batman's Hill is behind where the Grand Hotel now stands. The car park behind the hotel is next to the railway embankment that cuts through where the hill used to be. As might be expected, it wasn't long before Batman and Faulkner argued about ownership of land. But eventually a deal was struck, and Batman kept his land and his house on the north side of the river. Faulkner moved across the river close to where Crown Casino, the Arts Centre, and the restaurant and shopping complex we call Southgate now stand. To persuade him to do this, Batman paid him £5, about 350 English pounds by today's values, or around $1,000. Some time later, Faulkner built himself an inn, here at the corner of Flinders Lane and William Street. The original building is long gone, of course, but this plaque on the side of the present building records the event. He was later responsible for establishing Melbourne's first newspapers. Batman lived in his house until his death at the young age of 39. His grave has been lost, but it was somewhere in the old Melbourne cemetery at this site, now occupied by Victoria Market. And this is Batman's memorial. It stands at the corner of the market car park. You'll notice that the inscription describes the land as unoccupied, reflecting sentiments from the Victorian era when this monument was erected. The settlement that Batman and Faulkner started quickly grew in size, but it was completely unplanned. People threw their rubbish into the streets. There were no sewers. People just dug holes for toilets. Thousands of sheep arrived and grazed. The river began to get polluted with human and animal waste. Relations with the local Aborigines deteriorated with violent deaths on both sides. The settlement didn't even have a proper name. Neither the British nor the New South Wales governments recognised Batman's land purchase as legal. Insofar as the British were concerned, the King owned the land and not the Aborigines. But by now, things had got completely out of control. Law and order is something we more or less take for granted today. But back then, it was often absent. It was going to have to be established if the settlement was going to survive. So, in 1836, Captain William Lonsdale was sent to the Port Phillip district by Governor to do just that. This is the street in the centre of Melbourne that's named after William Lonsdale. It runs east from Southern Cross Station towards Spring Street, close to where the State Parliament buildings are located. This corner, where Spencer and Little Collins Streets meet, is where Lonsdale's house was built, quite where Batman was living. He arrived with 30 soldiers and 30 convicts to establish law and order and prepare for the visit of the Governor, which happened the following year, in 1837. Governor Burke arrived with the surveyor Robert Hoddle. There are about 20 streets named after Hoddle, but this is the busiest. It runs from Richmond north towards the Eastern Freeway. The town was finally to get the name that we know it by today. Burke named it Melbourne after the British Prime Minister of the time. Interestingly, he named Williamstown after the then King, perhaps because he thought it more likely to become the main settlement. Burke had Hoddle produce plans for the town. He named streets after the New South Wales governor, members of the British royal family and famous men of the time. There's some disagreement about the origins of Elizabeth Street, but it was probably named after Burke's recently deceased wife. Stone buildings were erected to replace the tents and other temporary dwellings. These rather grand houses that remain in Collins Street were built just a year or two later. Blocks of land were sold by auction. The average price was around £38. Comparing annual incomes, that equates to around 30,000 English pounds, $60,000 by today's values. The new town quickly experienced a boom. Within 12 months, this small area of around 1,500 square metres between King, Collins, Elizabeth and Flinders Streets contained around 20 houses, 10 hotels, 2 breweries, a post office, a police lock-up and courthouse, and a printing works, together with 10 other buildings and businesses ranging from a skittle alley to a bank. There were 4 additional hotels and a range of businesses and shops on the north side of Collins Street. This is La Trobe's cottage, Melbourne's first government house. It's been moved from its original location at Jolimont to a spot close to the Botanic Gardens, and it's open to visitors. The building was erected for the first superintendent of Melbourne, New South Wales, Charles Joseph La Trobe, who arrived to take charge in October of 1839, which is when the growth to a modern Melbourne really begins, and our story comes to an end. These were the places where Aborigines used to hunt and fish their homes, and it's taken little more than 2 lifetimes for the trees and the grass and the bush tracks to be replaced by what we see today. So if you live in a country where white settlement was relatively recent, next time you drive down a street in a town or a city, try to think about what was there before. Try to imagine the history that lurks behind the street names and the buildings, and even your own home. And give some thought to the people whose lives were changed forever when the white man came to stay. Here are some of the key locations mentioned in this programme about Melbourne. Burke Street, named after Richard Burke, Governor of New South Wales from 1831 to 1837. Queensbridge, close to where the small falls were, where Captain John Lancey anchored the Enterprise. The junction of Spencer and Flinders Streets, where Fawkner cleared land and built a house. Southern Cross Station, previously Spencer Street Station, and before that Batman's Hill Station. The corner of Flinders Lane and William Streets, where Fawkner built an inn. The corner of Spencer and Little Collins Streets, close to where Captain William Lonsdale had his first house built. The railway viaduct near Spencer Street, the site where Batman's Hill was located. Collins Street, which marked the extent of the earliest formal development. Its shopping and restaurant complex, the area where Fawkner moved to after his agreement with Batman. The Victorian Arts Centre. Fawkner Street, named after John Fawkner. Victoria Market, on the site where Batman was buried. His memorial is in a corner of the market car park. Hoddle Street, named after Robert Hoddle, the creator of Melbourne's first town plan. Dights Falls, where Batman signed his treaty with the local Aborigines. The site where La Trobe's cottage, the first government house, can be visited. Enterprise Park, where on August the 30th, 1835, Captain John Lancey landed and started to establish the first white settlement that was to become Melbourne.